Hello fear seekers, and welcome back to the channel. Your home is supposed to be your space, the one place that you can feel safe and unwind from the pressures of the outside world. But what if you came to learn that something else had taken up residence there, and had no plans of vacating? Today, we're going to be diving into some creepy, allegedly true, haunted house horror stories. Now, before we get underway, I'd just like to address something really quickly. There's been a distinct lack of content coming out of this channel for the last month and a half. To make a long story short, I've been having PC problems for the last few months, and it has affected my ability to reliably and consistently put out videos. I'd just like you all to know that it finally seems to be taken care of, and that you can expect weekly uploads every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday going forward. Now without further ado, sit back, ignore those unseen footsteps, and get ready to ferment your fears. In Emigrant, Montana, a village-sized town that has roughly 500 people, resides a large ranch house with a main floor, an attic remodeled into a bedroom, and an ancient basement. It's located just before the Mill Creek Bridge that crosses the Yellowstone River. It is a very large house with acres of land. My grandma and grandpa raised my dad and his sister, Aunt Elle, and their half-sister there. It was built in the late 1800s or early 1900s, and because it was a massive property with a barn, a separate garage, multiple chicken coops, and fields for livestock or crops, naturally, a few ranch hands had died on the property before they had moved in. For an idea of what the house looks like, there is a large main floor consisting of 2 bathrooms, 4 bedrooms, a laundry room, and a huge kitchen. Up the staircase, which is down a lengthy hall from the living room, leads up to only one room. I think it used to be an ordinary attic back in the day, but when my dad grew up there, it had already been remodeled into a bedroom. This was my Aunt Elle's bedroom. I have talked to Aunt Elle before about her bad experiences in the house, most occurring in her solitary attic bedroom. She told me she had suffered from terrible, screaming night terrors often, and even as a teenager refused to sleep up there and instead slept on a mattress in the living room with my grandma. She once described one of her night terrors to me. In her dream, she was being pinned to her bed in the attic, unable to move, surrounded by numerous human-like figures in red robes. To me, this sounded like sleep paralysis, but she was thrashing around and screaming in her sleep, so it couldn't have been. Aunt Elle was pretty scared after that experience, and my grandma bought a small crucifix for her to wear as a necklace. They were somewhat religious, Catholic, and attended a local church, but usually just my Aunt Elle and grandma would go. The rest of the family didn't seem to care about religion. But while wearing the crucifix, she found that the night terrors stopped, even when sleeping in her haunted room. She said it made a huge difference, and she was finally able to feel almost safe in her room, and that everything was getting better. Aunt Elle doesn't know how, but she misplaced the necklace a few years later, and almost immediately, the terrible dreams and restless nights came back. It became so bad that apparently they had an exorcism, even though that might not be the correct term because only certain priests are licensed by the Vatican to perform real exorcisms, I guess. But I'd call this a Montana village version of an exorcism. My grandma called on members of the church, asking for help after she became increasingly concerned with Aunt Elle's behavior. Among the other strange happenings around the house and property, like cupboards opening, objects moving, strange noises, etc., many church members came to the house, including the pastor, and some drove from hours away to participate. They all stood in a circle in the living room and held hands, praying and attempting to rid the house of whatever was haunting it and the family. Aunt Elle says some people even started speaking in tongues. I find that part hard to believe, personally, but I love and trust my aunt, and I'd like to believe it happened. Even with sage burning, crucifixes hung up above doors, and a group of devout Catholics holding hands and chanting, the demonic spirits never left the house. The Montana-made exorcism had failed. There wasn't much my grandma could do. They were not about to leave the house, so they tried to live with it. Not long after the exorcism of the house, my Aunt Elle remembered her old crucifix working for her, and soon bought another one, almost identical to the first one she wore. Once again, the hauntings and odd sleep behaviors calmed down until they eventually grew up and moved out. The house was kept in the family, but everyone went their separate ways. They might have rented the place out for a while, through the late 80s and 90s, but I'm not sure. Fast forward about 15 years, right before I was born. My dad, mom, and older brother, who was only 1 at the time, got permission from the family to rent the house, and moved in to run their horse and glass etching business from home. It was also a beautiful spot to raise kids, right on the Yellowstone, with so much to entertain us. I was born in 1998, and lived in that house for about 6 years. I only have memories, though, from being ages 4 to 6 in that house, and my brother was 6 to 8 and has even better memories. My parents told us countless stories after we had moved out and grown older. We all remembered how creepy it felt living there, and we all agreed it was haunted. Once I was no longer in a crib, I got my own bed and room. My room was next to the kitchen, but my brother's was really far away, on the other end of the house. I hated the way my room felt, so I played in my brother's room a lot. The main floor was honestly massive and really stretched out, like a maze almost, especially for a 5-year-old. My parents took the attic room for privacy. My dad told me that shortly after moving in, and while I was too young to know what was happening, the night terrors began. My mom was sleeping in the living room on a futon alone at first, most nights, which wasn't out of the ordinary because my dad would snore really loud and she couldn't sleep through it. She later admitted she couldn't stand the vibe coming from that room anyways. My brother and I always had nightmares. I especially had terrifying ones about the house itself that I will never forget. We rarely slept in our rooms, which is normal for kids that age, and eventually it got to the point where every night we slept by our mom on the futon. Our own rooms gave us the creeps, and our parents knew it and never once questioned it. I know my brother and I were not scared to sleep alone, just scared to sleep alone in that house. The whole property gave off a creepy feeling, but we felt the safest together. My dad still slept alone, in the same attic where his sister experienced a repetitive demonic presence 20 years prior. I know he remembers living in the house as a kid, so I'll never understand why he stayed in that room. Most nights, he would get night terrors and scream so loud we could hear it downstairs, down the hall in the living room. I could tell it scared my mom too, although she handled it well. He would scream bloody murder until my mom would go to the attic to wake him up. This became a routine thing, but never once got less freaky. He suffered from extreme insomnia at this house, being too scared to fall asleep, or just couldn't sleep. I remember my dad looking like a zombie to me during this time, probably from being so restless and working a lot. He did not take on to the whole religion thing as a kid, and never turned to the church for help. Talking to him later on, however, he admits it was very haunted. His night terrors usually involved my brother, mom, or myself getting murdered. He spared me the details most of the time, and didn't ever feel comfortable talking about his terrors. I could tell it scared him though. My mom, who is an atheist, although also raised Catholic, had her sandblasting machine set up in the creaky, leaky basement that had stairs down from the kitchen, and a cellar door outside leading to it as well. The concrete staircase spiraled down and was pretty steep. The basement itself was riddled with mice, and I think we even found a feral cat with babies down there once. It honestly looked like an old, damp torture chamber, with terrible lighting and mold everywhere. My mother spent countless hours in that basement, putting designs into glassware and tiles to sell so she could help my dad support us. She told me she always had a terrible feeling being down there alone, and hated working in the dim light. Often, she would open the cellar door to let light in, but she hardly let my brother or I keep her company while she was working. Around 2004, we moved out, and the family sold the whole riverfront property for roughly $1 million to some rich guy who wanted to rent the rooms out for fishermen. Last I checked, though, it has since been sold or rented out to some hippie who raises goats. I drove by it last week, and you can see through the giant glass windows that she has the rooms illuminated with red lights for some reason. My mom began having sleep paralysis at that house, but doesn't get it much anymore. My parents divorced in 2014, and she is now engaged to someone else, about to be happily married this March. My dad's night terrors continued for years after we moved out, but eventually, they stopped. His insomnia never went away though, and he was restless until the day he passed away. It was last weekend, at the young age of 50. Since I was maybe 5, I have been having routine nightmares, crazy lucid dreams, and constant sleep paralysis. Even though I live away from my family now, and in my own apartment, I have had a handful of petrifying paranormal experiences with my boyfriend. My brother is 23 now and takes care of my grandma in the apartment my dad died in. He hasn't had nightmares like he used to, I think. We don't talk that much anymore, but we are both busy people. My cousin, Aunt Elle's daughter, recently told me she also suffers from sleep paralysis and oddly frightening dreams, although she never lived in the ranch house. They did come visit a lot when we lived there, so she had spent enough time in the house. We are both 20 years old now. We don't talk much nowadays, but we always felt a stronger relationship than the other cousins did because we look identical and sound alike. None of her brothers or sisters had any problems like that. It's currently 5:20 a.m., and I'm telling this story because my Aunt Elle called me about an hour ago. This was out of character for her because she has a normal 9-to-5 job and thus a normal sleeping schedule. She doesn't work tomorrow, but it's still a little strange. She called me to tell me she found her original crucifix, which she swore she had lost 30 years ago in that house. She gave it to her daughter and told her to wear it, as Jesus is supposed to protect you from demonic presences, she said. She also decided to give me her second crucifix, hoping it might protect me from whatever invisible presence might be around me. I plan on never taking it off, as she really wants me to have it. Please understand that I know millions of people experience sleep paralysis and nightmares every day, and they aren't demonic, even though they feel that way. Scientists can somewhat logically explain why these things happen to us in our sleep, with science. However, I don't feel like my family's experience can be explained completely. I was raised without a god to pray to, and have never been religious, in fact, doubting the presence of a higher power. Last Saturday when my dad passed away happened to be one of the gloomiest winter days. Once his soul let go and left his body, the sun came out from behind the dark clouds. I can feel, for certain, he is not far away. He is in the beautiful, clear sunsets that happened every night this week, in my thoughts, and also forever in my heart. It could just be a coincidence, or a silly way to cope, but I suddenly have no doubt he is watching over my family and I. I know this was an unreasonably long story, but everything I recall myself, and that was told to me by my Aunt Elle, Dad, Mom, brother, and Grandma, is true. I did not make any of this up, and I did not exaggerate any details intentionally. Keep in mind that I was very young when I lived there, and it's totally possible my young mind interpreted some events as scarier/different than they actually were. But my dad's night terrors were scary as hell, no matter what age I was. I missed that house, oddly enough. I had my first memories there, with plenty of amazing ones to help weigh out the scary ones. I'm still not sure if I believe in Catholicism or any religion, but there just may be lost souls walking around us. Sorry if this is all crazy to you, somewhat disorganized, and if I put in too much unimportant information and rambled on. I never thought I would share this haunting here, but I had to write this. I tried to proofread the best I could. Rest in peace, Dad. You will never be forgotten. Okay, well, I have been wanting to share this story for a while, and I hope this is the right place. Please excuse my grammatical/syntax errors. It's 5 a.m. I am 23 years old, and have lived in the same house for probably 20 years or so. I moved back home after college, because nursing school debt sucks. Growing up, I always thought I was, well, just a wuss or scared easily. I would often feel watched or followed in my home. I thought I saw stuff out of the corner of my eyes, etc. As far as I can remember, as a child I always felt creeped out and never alone in my house. Fast forward to my first year home from college, I had been working out downstairs. I was an amateur boxer at the time, and had some bags and other workout equipment in the basement, when suddenly my boxing bag, a heavy bag that doesn't move on its own very easily, was swinging like someone had just thrown a front kick into it as hard as they could. I was in my room, also in the basement, wrapping my hands, so I walked over to see if my stepdad or dog had come by and hit it. No one was downstairs, and at that time I remembered no one was home, and could even hear my dog upstairs walking around. At the very moment I realized this, out of the corner of my eye I saw a black figure standing in my doorway. The room felt cold, and I froze, feeling nothing but fear and uncomfortableness. I honestly had never felt that uncomfortable in my life. After praying a lot in my head and regaining my senses, I walked upstairs and called my mom immediately, told her the story, and when she got home she, well, dropped a friggin' bombshell on me. She told me that her and my stepfather had paranormal experiences that began when my brother and I were in grade school, shortly after moving in, and they had even had my priest come and perform an extended blessing. I and my family are Orthodox Christian, and it is a tradition to have a yearly blessing anyways. It started off with little things. Apparently when I was very little, though I do not remember, I would refuse to go play in my room. When my mom would ask why, I apparently told her multiple times, "Because there's a man in there." She started seeing and hearing things quite often, those bumps in the night type of things. My dog would be found staring intently at apparently nothing, sometimes from the top of the stairs facing down the stairs. To put that in context, she was a skilled bird hunting dog, one of the best around at the time. My uncle still gets after us for not breeding her. A German short-haired pointer, and I remember seeing her pointing, front leg bent, ears up, staring like there was a bird right in front of her she couldn't wait to grab, down the stairs when there was no one there, and ignoring my commands multiple times. Seeing a hunting dog pointing in full stance at nothing is, well, unsettling. Well, at one point things started getting worse for my parents. Mind you, I still knew about none of this until college. While me and my brother were in high school or middle school, and away at my biological father's house for the weekend, my mother was reading in bed, and heard what she thought was my stepfather coming up the stairs. She hollered at him to bring her something, but he apparently ignored her and kept walking up. When the walking stopped, there was no one there. She claims she was scared beyond belief, and then felt something crawl into bed with her. She absolutely lost it and just claimed she felt incredibly threatened. She screamed for my stepdad, and of course, he thought she was crazy. My stepfather is a man's man, to be honest. Hunter, fisherman, outdoorsman, very skilled handyman, and kind of a simple guy. He believes in God, but he's not particularly religious, and not superstitious whatsoever. At this point in the story, he still thought my mom was full of it. My mom is 100% Lebanese, and is a religious Orthodox Christian, but not particularly a religious fanatic. She is fun, outgoing, and an all-around normal lady, but she has her beliefs about the divine and paranormal that some may think are silly. She's a staunch believer in the evil eye, for instance. I would describe her as far from overly superstitious or religious, though, even though there are some in my family that are from the old country and fit that description. So at this point, my stepdad still thinks she's exaggerating, silly, etc. One night, they hear something they describe as sounding like someone grabbed our porch furniture and threw it through the front windows. My stepdad grabs his gun and instructs my mom not to call 911 yet because he thought it might have been one of us or a friend, drunk or screwing around. He walks the entire house, perimeter and outside included, and finds nothing. He was perplexed, and so was my mom, but they went back to bed. The next night, or a couple nights after, they hear the same thing. Same thing happens. He finds nothing. He remains in the kitchen and decides to make a sandwich, and what happened next made him believe. He turned to face the kitchen counter after getting something out of the fridge when he saw, right in front of him, a gray, misty silhouette that walked right through him. He said he couldn't have gotten up the stairs fast enough, and told my mom in bed, "I believe you now." That same week, we had a family get-together, and a cousin brought over a friend. Halfway through the evening, this friend pulled them aside and told them that he knew they had a presence, something dark and maybe evil, and that they should think about cleansing the house. No one in our family knew about the occurrences, and no one told this gentleman, whom they had never met before. At that time, they called our priest, and he did the extended blessing I talked about previously, and the house was cleansed. Nothing happened for a very long time, and things felt nice to me, though I had no clue about what had happened at the time. Fast forward now to the day I called her after the basement incident, and she fills me in on all of the above. She said we should get holy water and oil and bless the house immediately, which we did. Now, this is when things started getting worse. Months later, I had a friend over, and we always used to screw around and prank my older brother. Even at 21, we were all a bunch of grown-up kids. One night, my brother was resting on the couch, and claims he saw a hand reaching towards him from the reflection in the window. The window was directly across from the couch. He responded with, "Sam, knock it off." And when the hand was about to touch him, he jumped up and tried to chase whoever it was. He was confused when no one was there, and the next thing I know, he is busting down my door and waking me up. "Is Sam still here?" "No. Why?" "I just saw a ghost." We both slept uneasy that night. A couple months later, I have my other friend over, and yes, we're in our 20s and still have sleepovers. We were asleep in my room. I had a futon couch in my room, and I awoke to what I thought was him talking, but it didn't sound like him, and I only caught the tail end of what sounded like a sentence. After it stopped, he immediately goes, "Was that you talking?" Now, it was clearly not my voice and not coming from my general direction. I told him no, and I immediately felt scared and threatened. The only thing I could say was what I was thinking. "Dude, do you feel this?" The room just felt dark, full, busy almost, and like we were clearly not alone. I jumped up and flipped on the light. We were both scared out of our minds the rest of the night. We contacted our priest again and arranged another blessing. Things were good after that for a very long time. Recently, however, this last summer/fall, a Dutch friend from college was living with us temporarily in our spare bedroom. One morning, I awoke to a text from her asking if I had come home at 3 a.m., which is not unusual for me. I work night shifts, so I'm usually up late. I said no and asked why. She told me she'd talk about it when she got home. When she got back, she told me how she had heard someone clearly open our front door and walk into the kitchen loudly, and when she went to the bottom of the stairs to yell at me, I usually am loud too, and clumsy, there was no one downstairs and no lights on. We then proceeded to tell her our history with the house. She didn't stay with us much longer after that. Also, sometime in between there, our cousin from Cali and her son, Leo, were staying with us. One day, she told my mom, paraphrased roughly, "I don't know if I am just used to the quiet suburbs because of being from the city, but Leo and I thought we heard footsteps periodically during the day going up and down the stairs." My mom tells her the history of our house, and she bursts into tears. She didn't sleep at all that night, and left early the next morning. So lately, I've been hearing stuff again, had a couple weird occurrences, and am generally spooked. We're going to talk to our priest about this. I feel safe. I am religious, as I mentioned before, and we have blessed icons of Christ and the saints around the house. I am not pushing my beliefs on anyone, or asking you to believe what I do, just sharing a story, and perhaps seeing if anyone has ever dealt with anything like this. I grew up in a haunted house, although it would probably be more accurate to say that I grew up in a few different haunted houses. Even now, we have an entity in our kitchen who we jokingly call the fridge ghost, as it likes to hang out by the fridge and occasionally open it in the middle of the night. But for this particular post, I am going to talk about a house I lived in until middle school. It is located on a street called Cherry, which my friends and I always joked about for obvious reasons. However, nothing about the feeling I had when I lived in that house with my family was anything to joke about. My friends never wanted to spend the night at the house I grew up in. All of them had the same bad feeling staying there, this sinking feeling that formed in the pit of their stomachs before something would happen. And unusual things inevitably would, more often than not, happen. Doors would regularly open and close on their own. This was something that I chalked up to the tilt in the foundation, at least at first. But when you hear doors, cabinets, and drawers slam in the middle of the night, you start to question if it really is just regular house noises. The windows would open and shut on their own as well, which is a little harder to pin on a shifting foundation. There were a couple times that the televisions would turn on and off on their own. Sometimes, the volume on the television sets would go up and down on its own as well. There were other times that channels would show up on the television sets that I had never seen except on those sets. I could probably blame the odd television behavior on magnetism, or the fact that both television sets were quite old. However, the strange things I would see on those off channels through the static are enough to convince me that there might have been something else going on there. I would often hear noises in the vents, like things were crawling around in them. Sometimes, it sounded like bodies were being dragged through the ventilation shafts. Sometimes I would hear scratching on the walls, or the windows, or other out-of-the-ordinary sounds like footsteps on the floor. My mom used to tell me that it was little woodland creatures who got into the insides of the walls, but I never saw these animals. The closest I came to seeing anything close to that was one family of skunks we found living under our porch. But after moving them out safely to the woods, we never saw any other animals that could account for making the types of noises I was hearing. Sometimes I heard whispering, other times I heard yelling, like a faint cry through the walls. There were other times I would find weird yellow liquid on the walls or other similar substances. My mom used to say it was mold and not to touch it until she could clean it up, but it didn't look like mold to me. It didn't look like any of those substances could be made by anything living. I would also see ghostly figures wandering through the house. When I was young, I used to talk in great detail with what I think was a child, female entity. It was more like a one-way conversation with the entity, although sometimes it would answer in its own way. I wrote an essay about my friendship with that ghost for one of my classes later on, and submitted it as fiction so the teacher wouldn't think I was crazy. But the truth is that my friendship with that ghost and some of the other presences was real. Of course, there was the typical haunting stuff too, like objects being thrown, pulled, or just simply going missing altogether. I used to joke with my mom that the wall trolls or house gnomes had made off with our stuff, to which she would just roll her eyes. When my mom started seeing some strange entities peering at us through the windows or as we were sleeping, she started to take my stories more seriously. She won't agree with everything I've claimed to see in that house, but she will definitely admit that there were presences that would appear. I often saw toys come to life, including a doll my aunt had brought me back from Russia. I had a dream that the doll was trying to kill me by choking me to death. When I woke up, the doll was sleeping next to me in my bed. No one had ever moved it there that night. I ended up blessing the doll and throwing it away. To this day, I don't like dolls and will not sleep in the same room with one. I remember that the landlord who lived in the house next door was always asking us how things were going in the house. My mom told me to keep quiet about the things we saw because the rent was cheap and she didn't want to upset her. But even though I never got any direct answers from the landlord, I could see by her behavior that she must have known something was wrong with the house. Perhaps the strangest thing was that the house didn't particularly have a dark past or a history attached to it that would make it stand out as a hub for spiritual activity. The landlord was cranky and her attitude could have contributed to the overall negative vibe, but other than that, we never knew what in particular had made the house haunted. I didn't exclusively see evil entities in the house either. Like I said, I formed some friendships with the ghosts, and I even saw other entities that I can only describe as being little people, and entities that looked like what people say greys look like, but they were not aliens. This leads me to believe that the house was built on top of some ley line or portal that opened up into other realms. Maybe a more accurate title would be that my house was a gateway. I am not sorry that I had the experiences that I have. In fact, I think it broadened my horizons and showed me from an early age that there is more to the world than what we can physically see. I will always think of the friendships I formed with the ghosts and other entities fondly. For some people, my experience might have a rational explanation, and that is fine. I have always had an open mind and am happy to listen to many sides of an argument. But for me, the experiences I had in this house growing up were tangible and not just the imagination of an elementary school kid. They are something that has colored my view of this beautiful and mysterious world and has opened my eyes to all kinds of realms of possibility. Hey guys, glad to see you made it to the end of the video. I'm sorry if it's obvious that I'm a bit under the weather. I tried to hide it as best I can, but I was just too excited to finally get another video out. Have you ever dealt with living in a haunted house? Let me know in the comments below. As always, if you have any scary stories you'd like me to read, feel free to submit them to the email in the description. I would be honored to read them. Okay guys, that just about wraps up the video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So long, Fear Seekers. I'll see you in the next video.